He just sat there on that dock, same as every morning, watching the lake like it owed him something. Corporal Nadeau had been doing this drive for 6 weeks. The same gravel road, the same patrol car, the same cup of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder, and every single morning the old man was already there, sitting on that weathered dock with a fishing rod he never seemed to actually use, just holding it, watching the water. "Hasn't moved in an hour," Nadeau said, not to anyone in particular. Sergeant Tremblay didn't look up from her clipboard. "He won't. You've met him?" "Knew his wife before." She left it at that. The town of Lac Beaumont sat in a fold of the Laurentians north of Montreal, one of those places that exists mainly on the maps of people who grew up there and nowhere else. 312 people, one general store, a volunteer fire department, and a church that doubled as a community hall every second Saturday. The lake was its whole identity, a long, dark stretch of water that caught the light wrong in the mornings and made everything look like an old photograph. The man on the dock was Henry Caldwell, widower, former schoolteacher according to the file. Kept 2 hives of bees and a small vegetable garden he clearly didn't tend properly. His truck was a 1987 Ford that ran better than it had any right to. To the people of Lac Beaumont, he was a quiet fixture, someone you waved at, someone who brought honey to the church fundraiser in unlabeled jars, someone whose name came up in the same breath as phrases like "keeps to himself" and "been here forever." He had moved to the lake 22 years ago. No one questioned it. People moved to the Laurentians to disappear from the noise of things, and Henry Caldwell had disappeared very thoroughly. What was happening on the far side of the lake, however, was the opposite of quiet. For 4 days, a cell of 6 men had been occupying the Desrochers logging camp, an old operation shut down a decade ago, its equipment left to rust in the boreal. The men had arrived 3 nights before with a van full of encrypted comms equipment, enough food for 2 weeks, and 1 hostage, a federal crown prosecutor named Isabelle Gauthier, who had been taken from a parking garage in Montreal and driven north through the dark. Nobody had claimed responsibility. Nobody had made demands. The silence itself was the threat. The RCMP had set up their command post in the general store, requisitioning the back room with its smell of sawdust and old magazines. Inspector Bourget ran the operation, a compact, precise man from Ottawa who wore his rank like a fact of nature and treated local knowledge like folklore. He'd brought a team of tactical officers, a negotiator who hadn't yet been able to open a line of communication, and a satellite uplink that kept dropping signal in the trees. Sergeant Tremblay had offered what she knew about the camp, the roads, the lake. She'd been listened to politely and then redirected to perimeter management. She'd also suggested, twice, that someone talk to Henry Caldwell. Both times, Bourget had looked at her the way a man looks at a well-meaning suggestion he has no intention of following. On the 4th morning, Corporal Nadeau stopped the patrol car at the bottom of the road that led to the dock. The old man was already there. "You ever actually talk to him?" Nadeau asked. Tremblay was quiet for a moment. "Once, at Louise's funeral. He shook my hand and said she was a good woman and that the town was lucky to have her as long as it did." She paused, and then he looked at me for a second with these eyes. I don't know how to describe it. Like he was reading a report. Not unkind, just precise. She shook her head. "I looked him up after. Couldn't find anything past 1987. Nadeau looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, "that before 1987, Henry Caldwell doesn't exist." Henry heard the patrol car idle at the end of his road. He didn't look. He'd been tracking the vehicle's pattern for 4 days. Where it stopped, how long it sat, which officer drove it in the mornings versus the evenings. He'd also been tracking the helicopters, the positioning of the tactical vehicles at the North Shore access road, the way the light in the general store never went dark before 2 in the morning. He knew what was in that logging camp. He'd heard the van the first night, the specific frequency of the engine, a diesel converted to run quieter, the kind of modification that wasn't commercially available. He'd heard the radio traffic too, faint and scrambled, drifting across the lake on the night air the way sound does over still water. Old encryption, Eastern European pattern, but used by someone who'd learned it secondhand, sloppy at the edges. He hadn't slept well since, not because he was afraid. He hadn't been afraid of something like this in a very long time. He hadn't slept well because he recognized the shape of it, the patience, the silence, the absence of demands, and he knew what came next if no one figured it out in time. He set the fishing rod against the dock post and looked at his hands, 67 years old. The knuckles still carried the memory of things he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. He'd come to Lac Beaumont for the silence, and the silence had been good to him. He'd built the dock himself, learned to keep bees badly but with genuine effort, grown tomatoes that were always a little too small. He'd learned the names of his neighbors' children. He'd learned which ice on the lake was safe in January and which wasn't. He'd also kept, at the back of his closet behind a cedar box of his wife's scarves, a locked case he hadn't opened in 9 years. He stood up from the dock. His knee complained the way it always did in the mornings. Trip pushed his muzzle against Henry's hand. Not Trip. That wasn't right. There was no three-legged dog here. There was only the dock and the lake and the question he'd been circling for 4 days. He walked back to the house. Sergeant Tremblay was the one who came to him in the end, not because Bourget sent her, because she decided to. She knocked at 7 in the evening, when the light was going gold through the birch trees. Henry answered the door before the second knock. "Sergeant," he said. "Coffee?" She stepped inside. The house was spare and ordered in a way that had nothing to do with decoration, more like a space designed for function, everything within reach, nothing unnecessary. Books on military history, hydrology, radio communications, a topographical map of the Laurentians pinned flat to the kitchen table, certain ridgelines marked in pencil. She stopped when she saw the map. "You already know where they are," she said. It wasn't a question. Henry poured 2 cups without answering immediately. He set hers on the table and sat down across from it. "Old logging camp on the northeast arm," he said. "They've got their comms on the roof of the main building. The antenna's jury-rigged but functional. They're using the tree line on the north side as visual cover, which means their blind spot is the lake approach from the southwest." He touched a point on the map. "There's a channel here, silted up, overgrown, doesn't show on any map made after 1991. I found it when I was clearing brush in the 2nd year I was here. You can get a boat within 400 meters of the camp without ever breaking the tree line." Tremblay sat down slowly. "How long have you known this?" 2 days. "And you didn't." "I called the number I was told to call if something like this ever came up." He looked at his coffee. "I was told to wait." She stared at him. "Wait for what?" He didn't answer that either. What Tremblay didn't know, what Bourget didn't know, what none of the tactical officers pulling double shifts in the back of the general store knew, was that 6 hours earlier, a brief transmission had gone out from the kitchen of a house on the edge of Lac Beaumont, encrypted on a protocol that hadn't been used since 1994, on a frequency that officially belonged to no one. It had been answered in 12 minutes. The voice that came back had been young and careful. Henry had given his authentication sequence, not a code name, not a call sign, just a sequence of 8 letters that corresponded to an operation that had never been made public and never would be. There had been a pause of several minutes while someone, somewhere, pulled a file that required 2 different senior authorizations to access. The voice that came back the second time was older. "We didn't think you were still active." "I'm not," Henry had said, "but there's a Crown prosecutor in that camp, and whoever has her isn't going to negotiate. You need people who understand the comms architecture they're running." "I do." Another pause. "Can you give us targeting data?" "I can give you everything," he'd said. "I've been looking at this lake for 22 years. Bourget found out at 10:47 in the evening when his satellite phone rang with a number he didn't recognize and a voice that introduced itself by rank and said words that made him lower himself slowly into his chair. He sat there for a long moment after the call ended. One of his tactical officers, Constable Bergeron, noticed his face and took a step toward him. "Sir?" Bourget held up one hand. He was trying to assemble the information into something that made sense, and it was refusing to assemble. He had just been told to stand down. All units. Encrypted communications to be powered down or switched to a secondary channel. Perimeter to be maintained but no forward movement. The operation was being transferred to federal jurisdiction of a kind that Bourget, in 15 years of RCMP service, had never personally encountered. He'd been told the same thing the FBI agent had been told in another story, in another valley, about another quiet old man. Except this time the words were, "The asset on the ground has control of the situation." Bourget looked at Tremblay, who had come back from the Caldwell property 20 minutes ago with an expression he couldn't read. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "what did he tell you?" She set her coffee down. "Everything we needed to know 3 days ago. They came across the lake, not from the road, not from the access points the tactical teams had been watching. They came across the water in the dark, in vessels that made almost no sound, low-profile inflatable craft with muffled electric motors, moving without lights through the channel Henry had marked on his kitchen map. Henry stood on his dock and watched them come. There were 2 craft, each carrying 6 operators. He couldn't see their faces. He didn't need to. He knew the posture, the way trained people sit in boats, weight forward, weapons indexed, every movement economical. He'd sat in boats like that himself, in darker water than this, in places with no names on any public map. A figure detached from the first craft as it passed closest to his dock. She was shorter than he expected, her hair pulled back hard, her face unreadable above the dark tactical vest. She paused and looked at him across the 10 meters of black water. She didn't speak. She raised 2 fingers in a brief, precise acknowledgement. He raised his chin in return, and then they were past him, moving toward the southwest approach he'd described, and the lake swallowed them. Sergeant Tremblay had come down to the dock without him noticing. That was rare enough that he filed it away as a mark of respect. "Who are they?" she asked. "The right people," Henry said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got clearance to give." She stood beside him, and they both watched the dark water, which told them nothing. Inside the house 40 minutes earlier, Henry had done something he hadn't done in 9 years. He'd unlocked the case. It was built into the floor of the closet beneath a false panel, not the back of the wardrobe. He'd learned from experience that the obvious hiding places were only useful if nobody was really looking. He'd pressed a sequence he still knew without thinking, the way a person knows the weight of their own name, and the panel had come up. The equipment inside was old, not obsolete, old in the way that certain tools are old, the way a good knife is old, because it was built to last and hadn't been asked to prove it in a while. A compact radio transceiver, military grade, with a frequency range that extended well beyond what was commercially available. A secondary power cell, an antenna assembly he could deploy in under 3 minutes. A sealed document pouch he hadn't opened since he'd last checked its contents in 2015 and found them unchanged. He'd set it up at the kitchen table. He'd powered it on. He'd listened first, the way you always listen first, for the shape of what's already in the air. What he heard confirmed what he'd suspected. The men in the logging camp were running an old Soviet-adjacent jamming protocol. Not Russian, not anymore. Something passed through 2 or 3 intermediary sources until the original architecture was barely recognizable. But he recognized it. He'd helped write the countermeasures for it in 1991, in a building in Bern that no longer existed under that name. He knew how to go around it. He'd transmitted for 6 minutes. Authentication, location, assessment, approach vector, comms vulnerability, suggested entry timeline. He'd described the southwestern channel. He'd described the antenna on the roof of the main building, and exactly how to take it down without triggering the secondary alert. The men inside didn't know they'd built into their own system. He'd described the woman, where she was being held, based on the single light source that had moved on the camp's west side at the same hour every evening, which was not the pattern of a person with freedom of movement, but of a person being escorted. He'd given them everything. When he signed off, the voice on the other end had said, "This is going to get complicated to explain afterward." "That's your problem," Henry had said. "Mine is the prosecutor." It was quiet for a long time. Tremblay had gone back to the command post to manage the perimeter officers, who were growing restless with the stand-down order and needed someone with authority and patience to keep them in position. Bourget had retreated to a silence that felt, to the people around him, like the silence of a man reorganizing his entire understanding of a situation. Henry made tea and sat at the kitchen table and did not look at the closet. He thought about Martine, his wife, who had known, in the way that certain people know things they're never directly told, that the person she'd married had a past that predated her by a long way. She'd never asked, not once in 19 years. She'd asked him once, near the end, whether he was at peace with whatever it was he'd done, and he'd said he was working on it, and she'd said that was probably the most honest thing anyone had ever told her. He thought about the prosecutor, Gauthier, the file had said, who had been taken from an ordinary parking garage on an ordinary Wednesday and driven 4 hours north into someone else's idea of leverage, who had been awake in that camp for 4 days not knowing if anyone was coming. Someone was coming. The muffled sound came at 12 minutes past midnight. 3 distinct, suppressed reports from the northeast. Not an exchange, one direction, controlled, deliberate. Then silence. Then, 17 minutes later, the sound of the electric motors returning across the lake. They came back with 9 people and left with 10. The prosecutor was wrapped in a thermal blanket and walking under her own power. One of the operators had a hand on her elbow, not guiding her so much as steadying, the way you steady someone who has been scared for a long time and is not entirely sure yet that the scared part is over. The lead operator, the woman who had raised 2 fingers at Henry on the way out, came to the dock. She took off her helmet. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe mid-30s, with the particular kind of stillness that only comes from having been in a great number of situations where stillness was the difference between outcomes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in French, "The channel was exactly where you said it was. It doesn't move," Henry said. "That's the thing about the land. It remembers." She almost smiled. "The antenna array was factory wired the way you described. We were inside before they finished the first alarm cycle." She paused. "The prosecutor is fine, dehydrated, otherwise unharmed." "Good." She held out her hand. He took it. Her grip was straightforward and brief, the grip of someone who has shaken enough hands in enough circumstances to have stripped it down to its essential components. "The comms protocol you identified," she said. "Your debrief is going to be interesting." "I'm retired," he said. She looked at him with something that might, in a different light, have been amusement. "Of course you are." She turned and walked back to the boats. The operators loaded in with the same quiet precision they'd arrived with. The motors hummed. The lake accepted them again, and then it was just water. Inspector Bourget came at 2 in the morning. He drove himself, which Tremblay noted, and which meant something. He parked in the pull-off at the bottom of Henry's road, and walked up alone, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, his shoes getting wet in the dewy grass, because he'd forgotten he wasn't in the city. Henry met him on the porch. He'd left the light off. The sky was clear, and the stars over the Laurentians were extravagant, the way they only are when you're far from enough artificial light that the dark has room to be itself. Bourget stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was a careful man, and he was being careful now, assembling the words in the right order. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. Henry leaned against the porch railing. "You were doing your job. I was dismissing information I should have prioritized." Bourget's voice was even, controlled. "I was told twice by Sergeant Tremblay that you might have relevant knowledge. I treated it as a local suggestion rather than actionable intelligence. You didn't know what I was." "No," Bourget said. "I didn't." He paused. "I'm still not entirely sure I know now." Henry was quiet for a moment. The lake was invisible from the porch, but he could feel it, the specific quality of air that comes off open water, even in the dark. "The file that got declassified enough to make that call tonight," Henry said, "covers about 40% of what I actually did. The rest is still locked." He looked at Bourget. "That's not a boast. It's just an explanation of why there was nothing for you to find." Bourget nodded slowly. "The prosecutor is being taken to a medical facility in Montreal. She's asking questions about what happened and not getting many answers. She'll get some eventually. Will she get yours?" No. Bourget accepted this. He was a man who understood, Henry thought, the difference between information and truth, and the fact that the two didn't always travel together. "Is there anything you need?" Bourget asked. "Officially. Anything I can do." Henry thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "Tell your officers the perimeter can stand down," he said. "They've been on for 4 days. They're tired, and they deserve to go home." He paused. "And ask Sergeant Tremblay if she wants coffee. She's been at this longer than anyone." Bourget almost smiled. He put his hat back on his head. "There won't be a report that names you. I know. Some of my people are going to want to understand what happened tonight." "Tell them the operation succeeded," Henry said. "That's what they need to know." Bourget looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded. A single, considered nod, the kind that means more than most sentences, and turned and walked back down the grass toward his car. Sergeant Tremblay came last. She came without any official reason, which Henry respected. She came because she'd driven past his road 4 times in the preceding 3 hours, and finally stopped pretending she wasn't going to. She sat on the porch steps and accepted the tea he brought out without comment. They sat in the silence of the lake and the trees and the retreating dark. "Before 1987, she said, you really don't exist, not under that name." She absorbed this without flinching. Tremblay was the kind of person who processed information cleanly, which Henry had recognized within 30 seconds of meeting her. It was a quality he'd valued all his life and found rare. "When you came here," she said, "was it because you were done, or because you needed to be somewhere quiet before you could decide if you were done?" He hadn't expected that question. It was a good one. He looked at the dark outline of the birch trees at the edge of the yard, the ones Martine had planted in the second year and which were now taller than the house. "Both," he said. "For a long time, both. And then Martine got sick, and it became something else." He paused. "This place became real. That's the only way I know how to say it. It became the thing, not the cover." Tremblay nodded, looking at her tea. "The men in that camp," Henry said, "they're going to want to understand who gave the location. The operators won't tell them. But the people who sent the operators will have questions. Is that a problem?" "Not for me. I've answered those questions before." He looked at the lake, invisible in the dark, but present the way certain things are present, by weight, by sound, by the particular quality of the air around them. "It might mean more traffic on this road for a while. I'd appreciate it if you kept that quiet." "Of course." She left shortly after. Not rushing, not lingering, just finishing her tea and standing up, and saying goodnight the way a person does when they've received something they needed and know not to ask for more than was given. He watched her car lights disappear down the gravel road. Then he went inside. He locked the case. He put it back in the floor and pressed the panel down until it clicked. He washed the 2 tea mugs. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. In the morning, he would go to the dock. The fishing rod would lean against the post. The lake would catch the light wrong the way it always did at that hour, making everything look like something worth remembering. The bees would need checking. The tomatoes were getting leggy, and he'd been meaning to deal with that for a week. Henry Caldwell, retired schoolteacher, keeper of bees, fisherman who never caught anything, had work to do. He closed his eyes, and the lake held its breath, and the Laurentians went on being exactly what they were, old and patient and full of things that had no interest in being found.